All right, so last week, daughter number one was sick. Now, last night, daughter number two came down with a fever, so I'm recording this in anticipation of maybe not being able to make class here in the pre-dawn hours, trying not to wake anybody up. All right, so today we're going to talk about Invisible Man, as I said. And we left off with Optic White last time. Talked a lot about that symbolism, right? Optic and eyes, of course, are a huge motif throughout this, right? Because it's all about perception, self-perception, perceiving the society around us. And of course, that name, Optic White, right, being very symbolic, and also the manufacturing process that we talked about being very symbolic, and then even like who they sell it to and what it's used for, also being very symbolic, allegorical even. Anyway, one of the last things that happens there is that the narrator gets into a fight with Lucius Brockway. And this is a very episodic novel. Once again, in all of these episodes about we have some act of violence. And this is one of those acts. And it's because, Brockway is trying to protect what little he has. He's trying to protect his job. And there's obviously some miscommunication that happens there, etc. But then the crux of that, where I want to pick up today, is the lobotomy. And this, I think, is pretty interesting. I actually read an account last spring about some people in World War II, after they'd come home, had a lobotomy. And this one guy was actually, the son was telling the story of his father who had a lobotomy because he came back from World War II and struggled with violence, and was willing to give up whatever he had to keep his family safe and to not be that violent person that he was. So he had a lobotomy, and it helped with the violence to stem that off. But then the son also says it also just kind of made him a little bit of a zombie, made him kind of lose a lot of his personality. And so he could remember things and still go through his day. It's not like the movies, but it changed him pretty drastically. And so here, right, the narrator's going through this process, taking the violence out of him in one sense, and perhaps flattening him out once again, right? As soon as he starts to create some sort of sense of identity and starts to do something besides just getting pushed around by everybody throughout his whole life, they have to take that away. And even you'll notice that we think we're going to get who he is. They ask him his name. He just says, "I told them." He doesn't ever really reveal it to us because his identity still is not clear. He's still invisible in the eyes of this world as an individual. And he says, there was no getting around it. I could no more, this is 243 in my version, I could no more escape than I could think of my identity. Perhaps, I thought, the two things are involved with each other. When I discover who I am, I'll be free. And that is kind of like really one of the real major cruxes of this novel. All right, so that brings us up to Mary and the Brotherhood. So he does eat the yams, as we mentioned. I am what I am, and he's embracing where he has come from. But let's take a look at the eviction, where he kind of gets noticed in Harlem. So this old couple, right? They're getting evicted. All their stuff is being taken out, and he starts to give a speech. Right? He's using what he practiced and learned at school, and he kind of stumbles upon on 279 this word dispossessed. And that kind of becomes really like a central part of his speech. He also uses a baseball motif throughout, all right, because that was at the time the most popular sport, but also it is a symbol of America and Americana in our culture that they're trying to fit into, and being dispossessed from that. And so dispossessed, like they are literally, their possessions are being taken outside and put on the street. Right, but this becomes very, very symbolic, and it becomes a big part of the whole thing, right? Like, so even at 87 years old, this old couple cannot own anything. They cannot own part of America. They cannot participate in that American dream. And a lot of the American dream is based on individuality, and is based on material, right? The idea that you can work harder and achieve more, that you can provide a better life for your kids through your work ethic, right? And a lot of that is, comes down to something like buying a house. That's like the American dream. You can own property, which is the way classes were often distinguished in the old world. But what we notice here, though, if we look at society, is that there have been lots of formal and informal, spoken and unspoken rules and laws to keep black people from owning property. And certainly this dispossession here just displays that in the novel. I'll go on a little digression here, but the effect is not just material, but also psychological. And that is the crux of much of this novel. That what is the effect of living in a society that sees you as an expedient, as invisible, and does not allow you to participate in that society, even though it gives you the illusion of being able to participate. And so we have these cycles that we can never quite realize, like back at school, right? You can stay within that cycle. You can get as high as blood, so maybe if you're lucky, and that's it. You can never progress into society. And here again, right? It even goes as deep as spirituality. All they want to do is go back in the house and pray, right? And part of their possessions are symbolic of their life and all the different ways that dispossession happens. And so, well, what's the psychological effect this book looks at of not belonging, of being dispossessed, both literally and materially, but also spiritually, metaphysically, all the other different ways, right? And so, and this is very real, and it's historic. Like even just 2 years ago, NPR in the Triad put out a study and found that when all other factors are equaled, like credit score, minorities were less likely to get approved for mortgage loans. And they were trying to figure out, well, why is that, right? It's pretty automated and formulaic now. How is it that these biases are still built in the system, right? And there's all kinds of side notes we can go into, like genetic wealth and things like that, and inheriting credit and that sort of thing. But this concept is so key. Okay, how do you continue to work hard and get ahead in a society that psychologically disallows you to do that dispossesses you? And so, this is where I kind of reflect a little bit. In my life, I was the first Albert to get a college degree. I grew up on free lunch. I, grew up rather poor in bad neighborhoods sometimes, and moving up in different apartments, things like this. But I did not live in a society where I did not see people who looked like me succeeding. I saw people who looked like me owning property. I knew people who owned property, and that's just like a symbol, right? It's only one small aspect of it, right? And so, what happens if you live in a society where you have all those barriers, and then you don't see people who look like you, achieving certain levels of success? There's a huge unconscious or subconscious psychological battle that happens that he's kind of getting into here, right? It's all about the subtle ways that power is battled, right? And there's different ways to look at this. I know a lot of people in society would look at a life and say, hey, I had all these barriers, right? And I didn't grow up with money, and I still made it, and I'm not whining, right? And just kind of make it very selfish about them. Then there's others who can say, you know what, I had all these barriers in life, and if I had one more, that might have been the last one. That might have been the difference between owning a house and not owning a house, between having a steady job and not, right? And empathy instead is the answer. So that's a little bit of a digression, but it's kind of where I personally come into this novel and see this idea of dispossession being a really important concept through it, because it's not just dispossessed materially, it's dispossessed mentally as well. Okay, so as you read through that section, look for the things that are thrown out and stuff like that, and how those might be symbolic. All right, so he gets the wheels rolling. All right, he gets the crowd moving, and he gets noticed by the Brotherhood, which, if you read closely, you'll notice is a pretty communist organization. Which he even says, Brother Jack, on page 291, you mustn't waste your emotions on individuals; they don't count. This is a book about individualism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for whom Ralph Waldo Ellison is named, was all about the power of the individual. So clearly, this is not going to be a good organization. A lot of readers, myself included, didn't see that until too late, much like the narrator himself. Maybe that's why we didn't see it until then. If that didn't tip you off, right, you have this organization that discounts the individual in a book about individuality and finding your identity as an individual. When he is introduced, the narrator is introduced to the Brotherhood on 303 and so forth. You have some odd phrases like whispered behind, but don't you think he should be a little blacker? And then later on, he's asked to sing on 312. Like, nonsense. All colored people sing. This is not a range of unconscious racial chauvinism, and it is. Right? It goes right back to this idea of entertainment, the boxing ring, True Blood, all that stuff. Right? It's like, okay, it goes right back to the dispossession. Here's a limited avenue of success. Here's a limited category, and we see this today, 70 years later. All right, so I should have been a red flag. Should have been like, this is not a good organization to get into, but unfortunately, it is not. 1 hour later. So then he's staying with Mary, and Mary I think is an interesting character, and something I would love to have talked about. But she's one of the most redeeming characters, in my opinion, in this novel. She has a big heart and just wants to help people. But what does he find even in Mary's house? Right, this person who's shown him all of this generosity is this bank that she just thinks is funny. It says "feed me" on it, right? And it just kind of like eats away at the narrator. It gets in there, and at first he doesn't know why it is, and eventually he realizes, wait a minute, this is another example of subtle racism in our society, and it enrages him to the point that he smashes it, breaks it, right? This possession of this like very nice, sweet woman who's helping him out, who doesn't even see this realization that he has come to, because it is, of course, so deeply ingrained in all of us, says Ellison. All right, so he smashes it, puts it in the briefcase, also another symbol. Remember that? Remember how he got that? And tries to get rid of it. But as he's walking around town, right, people are like, "Don't throw that in my trash. Don't put your trash in my garbage." And it says, on 328, this one woman even says, "I don't know that some kind of garbage were better than others." Or he says that, and the woman says, "Never mind your impertinence," she said. "I'm sick and tired of having you Southern Negroes mess up things for the rest of us." And this becomes, again, symbolic. He's carrying around this trash, this luggage, this past, and he can't get rid of it. He can't just dump it like that, right? It is his burden, just like all of us, right? Our past becomes part of us, and it can be a nagging thing that we have to drag along and figure out what to do with it, but we can't just dump it, right? We can't just give it to somebody else. He tries leaving in the street, and someone says, "Hey, you lost something. You forgot something. This is part of you," right? And so our past, our experiences, our upbringing, those are all part of us. The society that we grow up in is part of us. How much we let it control us is perhaps the answer. The question, rather. Okay, so he can't get rid of that. He can't get rid of his past. This is nagging at him, this stupid briefcase with the broken image of the racist bank. And then we meet Ras, right? And a lot of readers want to read Ras as Malcolm X, but he's not. Okay, Malcolm X did not exist when Ralph Ellison was writing this book. Malcolm Little existed, and he was in prison. So, pretty unlikely that Ellison knew about who Malcolm Little was going to become. Interesting. Little side note, though, about the whole identity thing, right? Instead, it was probably after Marcus Garvey, who was, had this Jamaican background thing, who had this like back to African movement thing, and we certainly see that in the demeanor and everything of Ras and his philosophy and stuff. And then we have again more infighting, right? Ras and the narrator, Clifton, like they're just fighting, right? And they're not progressing because they're just fighting. And all that infighting that we've seen from just about page 1 is still present here, and it's impeding progress, right? But no one is really conscious or aware or fully seeing what is going on. The narrator is not seeing what is going on with the Brotherhood, for example, in the way that he's being used. All right, so another fun little quote here on 354. The conscience of a race is the gift of its individuals who see, evaluate, record. We create the race by creating ourselves, and then, to our great astonishment, we will have created something far more important. We will have created a culture. Okay. And so he's noticed that the narrator is pretty indoctrinated, but every time that he makes progress, he is moved. Right? He's a pawn, as we see, and we'll see this with the hat too later on. And so Ras is saying, "Hey, open your eyes. Don't pay attention to the stuff. You're being used." He's not seeing it. Ras is not perfect by any means either, but we have this recurrent idea of old habits, old things dragging along behind us, right? With the leg chain, Tarp's leg chain, right? In fact, he even describes him on 387 as still having this limp from dragging a chain. And so even though the chain is not there anymore, he changed his biomechanics. And this is, of course, again, symbolic. Our past drags us. Our past, it's not easy to get rid of. It is a weight that we have to carry with us. And so he keeps that leg chain as a memento of this past. And some of you, the astute readers, might remember that Bledsoe had something very similar in his office, right? And a lot of even the iconography around the school, right, was about, and the narrative said, well, is this, constricting or letting free? That's a good question, right? It's like, well, we carry these things with us, and we don't just forgive them. We don't just forget them. We don't just drop them off. They keep coming, right? We keep limping forward, and we keep bringing this shackle with us. Is the symbol, right? Just like the briefcase, and it makes progress very difficult, right? And that past, that part of us as a nation, right, is a weight that maybe everyone needs to bear. It's something that's happening here, but also we have individual weights. We have the two individuals here. It's a book by individuality, finding your identity, right, in the midst of all this history that has come before us and helped to form us. All right, so Tarp's leg chain bore the marks of haste and violence, looking as though it had been attacked and conquered before it stubbornly yielded. And there it is trying to realize that Ras wouldn't have gotten so big if his progress was allowed to continue. But under the false guise of progress, but not progressing too quickly, he's moved away from Harlem, moved to a different question. In the power void, Ras grows, violence grows. We'll see. He says, and finally, the invisible man, the narrator, is realizing some of this stuff that he's just getting pushed around, right? It's just another, power play thing. He's just a pawn. Now it's as though I had been suddenly awakened from a deep sleep. I guess we'll see how awakened he really gets. All right. I bumbled through that, so I'm sorry if you made it this far. Thank you once again.